Hey everybody, it's your boy. Before we get into the video, once again I must say, please do like, share and comment on the video because of the algorithm, and I do get lonely when I don't see you guys comment enough. Come on guys, don't make me feel alone in these trying times of lockdown. But anyway, with this new video, don't you feel as if we've gone backwards in time, back to the early 2000s? Hell, even the early 90s, when we were having debates and discussions about violent video games influencing the youth, causing crime and violence? Well, this news story is from Illinois, where once again politicians, Democrat politicians, obviously, have decided to blame GTA and violent video games for a recent spike in carjacking. Not only does Illinois have a problem with murder in Chicago, they also have problems with hijackings. Rather than trying to defeat the source of the crime, which comes from the inner cities and the situation that the people find themselves in, which is actually caused by their own state policies, but you know, obviously they can't admit they were wrong, otherwise they might lose elections and midterms, and we can't be having that. Rather than defeat the source of the violence and the carjackings, things that Thomas Sowell has talked about in his books, they're deciding to blame it on an outside source that has nothing to do with it. Study after study has proven that violent video games have done nothing of the sort to increase crime, to make people more violent. They apparently make you more aggressive, one study I saw, but that's because you get frustrated and angry at the video game, which all of us have been through. It does not suggest that you are aggressive forever, and that the more you play, the more aggressive you become as a person. It's just, you might get a bit annoyed, which would make some people aggressive. That is the extent that violent video games actually have some kind of effect on people. From what I've gathered from talking to various gamers in my life and looking at comments online, it seems to me that violent video games are not something that people want to do in real life. It's something that they do as a release. They know it's a fantasy, they know it's not real, they know that it's just at the end of the day a video game, but it's a release. It's something that allows them to put all their frustrations out on a fake character as opposed to a real person. Funnily enough, since the mass popularity of violent video games since the early 90s, although this is a correlation and it does not equal causation, I know, there's been a steady decline in violence up until the lockdown. I assume that will be a spike in violence, but the general trend for 30 odd years was that violent crime was going down and video games were becoming more popular. It's an interesting coincidence, isn't it? But nonetheless, but it is what it is. A rash of carjackings in Chicago over the past year has, of course, led some to point fingers at violent video games. Now, an Illinois lawmaker wants to amend a state restriction on selling violent video games to minors so that it would ban the sale of violent video games to anyone and would define depictions of motor vehicle theft as violence. Not only do they not want this being sold to minors, which minors shouldn't be playing it anyway, minors shouldn't be buying it, obviously it should be left to the parents to decide. Following the original publication of this article, a representative of the Entertainment Software Association, the US game industry's largest trade association, reached out with the following statement. While our industry understands and shares the concerns about what has been happening in Chicago, there is simply no evidence of a link between interactive entertainment and real-world violence. We believe the solution to this complex problem resides in examining thoroughly the actual factors that drive such behaviours rather than erroneously ascribing blame to video games based solely upon speculation. I couldn't put it better myself. That's essentially going to be the theme of the video. But these politicians can't do that because they caused it, or rather people in the past caused it and then they have simply made it worse. Now, why is there a lot of carjackings going on in Chicago recently? Is it something to do with lockdown? Are the police being defunded because of a certain issue that happened last year? Are the police being told to be less hands-on, shall I say, in their policing? There are many reasons why a lot of carjackings can happen. Are people being alone more often in their cars, stuck in not much traffic, allowing people to carjack them without any witnesses because everybody's locked up at home? I don't know. People in Illinois can tell me what is going on the ground. I'm just speculating here, but let's continue. Illinois' Criminal Code of 2012 restricts the sale of violent games to minors with a fine of $1,000 as punishment. Democratic State Representative Marcus Evans Jr. has introduced HB 3531, which would ban sales of violent games outright. The bill would also modify the definition of violent to include psychological harm and child abuse, sexual abuse, animal abuse, domestic violence, violence against women, or motor vehicle theft with a driver or passenger present inside the vehicle when the theft begins. So basically, if you make a video game and you do all these things, you can be banned, apparently. I don't know how psychological harm is violence. It's not violence. It's mentally damaging, yes, but that's not violence. It's using mental mental tactics to harm somebody. That is a complete category in and of itself. And violence against women? Why not violence against men? Oh wait, no, of course. These are Democrats we're talking about here, so men don't matter. I mean, to the Republicans they don't matter either, but in particular the Democrats really don't like men. Why violence against women in particular? Is that something that's so different to violence against men? In violent video games, you do nothing but kill men. In most of the violent video games I kill 99.99% mainly men. I can say that hand on heart. That is who I'm most likely going to be killing. But they don't care about that, and as for domestic violence, I've only got one game that depicts that. Wolfenstein 2, a really bad game. And that was the bad guy doing it to your mother. Yes, your dad, for some reason, is an anti-Semite who married a Jew. Yeah, it's stupid, guys. Don't worry about it. But basically what this guy is saying is that video games cannot depict any of these things, whether positive or negative. They will be banned because he allegedly fears that this would make people commit these acts, when obviously these acts are already going on, and if Chicago was locked down, which I assume it probably was, these things would have happened because people were locked up in home constantly, and well, as we've seen in my country and in other countries all around the world, these statistics went through the roof when that happened. That has nothing to do with violent video games. That has everything to do with locking people in their homes and not giving them much of an outlet. There were 1,417 reported carjackings in Chicago in 2020, double the number that occurred a year before, as the Chicago Sun-Times reports. It's been a big enough issue to prompt efforts like Operation Safe Pump, which has a private security firm posting guards at local gas stations as a deterrent. The bill will prohibit the sale of some of these games that promote the activities that we're suffering from in our communities, Evans tells the Sun-Times. He adds that games like Grand Theft Auto have become a huge issue in this spectrum. When you compare the two, you see harsh similarities as it relates to these carjacking. But of course, GTA does not encourage you to do carjacking. In fact, it discourages you because you get punished in the game for doing so. The police will come out and chase you. That's the difference. And if he'd played the game, he would have known that the game punishes you for committing crimes, even though you play as professional criminals. Grand Theft Auto has never in its entire history encouraged you to do these things. It's complete and utter bollocks. He's talking out of his ass. He's never played the game, and if he has played the game, then he should know better. He's just trying to find a scapegoat, and it's an old, tired scapegoat at that, for the problems that he has caused, because I can guarantee you that they're not his communities that are suffering from these hijackings. No gated community is going to suffer from a hijacking anytime soon, are they? The amendment would also repeal a section of the existing criminal code which requires retailers to display a 2-inch 18 label on all violent games. I have to assume that's disappearing because it was never enforced. And that's very interesting. Why are they removing the 18 label, which shows to parents what this game is suitable for? Not that a lot of parents ever really bother reading those labels and just buy these games for their kids anyway, but nonetheless, they're there for a reason. Tipper Gore and Al Gore, way back in the 80s, fought for these things so that parents could make these decisions, so that games could be censored and have their creativity stifled by this ridiculous categorization. I just find it funny that a democratic state is not enforcing this rule, which was something that was enacted in the early 90s by the likes of Jack Thompson, Tipper Gore, Al Gore, to stifle the video game industry and to stop them from making violent video games, because that's really what these ESRB and BBFC ratings are for. They're censorship. It's to make people not do the things that they would like to do in order to get a certain rating so that they can appeal to a wider audience. Trust me, films would be more violent, films would have more sex in them if the PG-13 rating wasn't a thing. And in fact, they could probably deal with more heavy subject matter in a better way if they didn't have these ratings. That's another conversation entirely. It's 2021, here I am, says the author, writing about efforts to ban violent video games. If you told me a decade ago that we'd still be talking about politicians trying to blame bigger problems on video games, well, I guess I'd have to believe you, because maybe nothing ever really changes. Well, you know, you did have the left doing this all last decade, Anita Sarkeesian, saying that it causes sexism. It seems like a lot of these games journalists have been living under a rock intentionally, or just have selective memory and ignore what their side is doing in order to attack the other side when they do it, even though Democrats are left-wing. What else can I add? Not much, other than people do forget, because people go on and on about Jack Thompson and the religious right and their efforts to censor video games when the left have been at it for God knows how long. Again, Tipper Gore, Al Gore, they're Democrats. And in fact, it won't surprise me if they're linked to Biden's cabinet in some capacity. These were leftists in the 80s doing it to music, and then in the 90s they were doing it as well for video games alongside Jack Thompson and the religious right. And Hillary Clinton said things like this in the early 2000s as well, when there was another repeat of this. It comes around in cycles. It's very easy to blame video games because of the direct nature of the medium. But of course, as we know, there is no correlation between increasing violence and carjackings and violent video games, and perhaps the correlation is more to do with coronavirus regulations and other state-enforced regulations that the Democrats like to do in places like Illinois and Chicago. But anyway, that's the end of the video. I've got nothing more to add. Till next time, I'll see you all later.